Good morning, everyone, and welcome to hopefully our last virtual Power Breakfast. As I think all of us are slowly seeing things opening up, and I think we're all hopefully in the next 3 months we'll be in a situation we can maybe actually have breakfast and share some coffee and good conversations together. So let's hope for sure. My name is Michael Skinner. I am the CEO of the Innovation Cluster in Peterborough, as well as the City of Kawartha Lakes. And today we've got some pretty amazing presenters that we're going to talk to you about. So today's breakfast is basically going to talk about the impact and shifts from COVID-19. Obviously, the last 16 months for anybody in business has been is probably one of the craziest roller coasters you could ever be on. Whether we're open, we're closed, it's opening up, it's closing down. Every time we have a new wave coming in, all these changes. And so I know as business people, we're constantly trying to understand, what's happening at a local level, what's happening at a national level, what are the trends, what's happening right now and what's also going to stop happening and how are things going to change. And both of our presenters today will have different aspects and scenarios of that. And I think this information is going to be very, very powerful for us to obviously hopefully recover and go back to whatever the new normal is, but into something that's at least a little more consistent and easier for all of us to understand when we're making business decisions and trying to be proactive as opposed to reactive. I always want to thank our core funding partners, so Sir Stamford Fleming College, Trent University, Peterborough Angels, City of Peterborough, City of Kawartha Lakes, Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and FedDev. I mean, these are organizations that really help us do what we do today. Without the funding, we can't deliver the programs, all these workshops, but also the programs that we deliver today. And really the support today, we've got just over 66 different clients spread across the City of Kawartha Lakes and the City and County of Peterborough. And we wouldn't be able to support those clients and do what we do if we didn't have these funding partners. And on top of our core funding partners, we've got lots of other partners as well. So zone partners, program partners, knowledge partners, a great group of organizations in our collective communities that have really come together to help us both deliver programs as well as ensure we have the financial support to continue delivering what the Innovation Cluster does. We've got basically 6 team members, although one of our team members is off on mat leave. So basically right now we've got 5 team members, which are supporting just over 66 clients. So a great group of individuals that are passionate about entrepreneurs and seeing what entrepreneurs can do for our community. On top of those currently 5 or 6 employees, though, we've got an amazing board of directors. These are all volunteers, both made up from academic, industry, business, all really leaders in our community that are here as volunteers to really help us drive and shape the face and landscape of entrepreneurship within our community. Now, for those of you who are new to either our Power Breakfast or maybe new to the region or not necessarily sure what the Innovation Cluster is all about, we basically impact our entire region. So we cover the City of Peterborough, the County of Peterborough, basically the City of Kawartha Lakes, all the way up to Haliburton. So a very large, about 6,000 square miles is a very large catchment area. And our job basically is to strengthen innovation and entrepreneurship capacity. So a lot of what we're doing is, we said, running workshops. Previously, before COVID, we really tried to drive as many social collisions as possible. We tried to connect like-minded individuals and individuals that we felt would have a lot of synergy to work together. We really brought them together. We've obviously pivoted for the virtual world to try and do that as much as we could in the virtual world. But I know all of us can't wait to get back into some sense of physical contact and really to continue that networking and really building that capacity within our region. We help companies on a new formation and growth. Starting off, building any kind of innovative company, I mean, typically coming up with an innovative idea is hard on its own, but build all the corporate structure, finance structure, how things are laid out, all of those pieces on kind of building your company. A lot of times, obviously, you don't know what you don't know. And so our job is to try and give that information to you in bite-sized chunks. It can be very overwhelming. And what we were trying to do is, work through a program to give you that information as you need it and to make sure that you're supported along the way for you to hopefully build a new innovative employer in our region and basically give back to our economy by creating much higher paid, innovative jobs. And the last thing is growing our knowledge-based economy. And so this is really the broader base of just making sure that we've got, what we call knowledge workers or gold collar workers in our region, making sure that they're there. And we focus on 4 sectors. So clean technology, ag tech, digital technology, and healthcare. And now it doesn't mean that if you're innovative that you can't come work with us if you don't fit in one of those 4 buckets. But we really try to make sure that we're constantly promoting those 4 buckets and that we're building up that capacity within our region. The last thing, anybody who's joining in who doesn't know how to become a client is very, very easy. www.innovationcluster.ca. There's a button in the top corner that says apply. Please just click on that and fill out a form. You'll go through a process where we'll go through an interview, work through your understanding where you are from a business point of view, and hopefully you fit within our criteria. And we'd love to have you join us as a client. So next, I want to first thank Peterborough and Kawartha Economic Development. They sponsor these power breakfasts, and obviously when we get back in person again, they'll also be sponsoring hopefully some nice eggs Benedict and some great coffee as well. But they basically help us do what we do. And if it wasn't for Peterborough Economic Development, we couldn't do what we do. Today, I'm pretty lucky because not only do we have Rhonda Keenan, the president and CEO of Peterborough Economic Development, coming on, and there she is there, to talk a bit about the organization for a second. But today she's really going to deliver an idea of some of the things we're going to see coming out of COVID. And Rhonda and her team have been working tirelessly for the last 16 months, I think, to react and pivot and to try and communicate as effectively as you can on how some of the national and provincial health regulations, how they impact local businesses, really trying to work through whether it was supply chain issues. I mean, her team's been working around the clock, really trying to make sure that we basically could stabilize our economy, and now obviously really drive it out and really drive us a plan to recover and hopefully recover faster than the other communities out there. So I'm going to turn things over to Rhonda, and good morning and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thanks, Mike, and thank you everyone for joining in and listening in. I'm not sure how much information I'm going to be able to share, just because we're still a lot of unknowns at this point in time, but we'll wait until we get our slide deck ready. But just wanted to talk a little bit about Peterborough and the Kawartha's economic development. And so we are funded by the City of Peterborough and the County of Peterborough to be the lead regional economic development agency. And so what that means is we do a lot of traditional economic development work, which is investment attraction. It's that business retention and expansion opportunities with our existing businesses. But we also are responsible for tourism, and that's supporting our tourism dependent businesses. It's attracting visitors to this region. It's attracting those meetings and conferences and sports tournaments, not so much in the last 16 months, but that's certainly something that we're responsible for. And then we're also responsible for operating one of the 54 small business centers in the province. And those are for startups that are not technology based. Those are those small businesses that are more regionally focused or locally focused to serve the local market. And that's why we're such a great alliance and partner with the Innovation Cluster, because I think between the two organizations, we're able to support every business that operates in this region. And so we are a pretty active organization, and I'm definitely happy to be speaking with you today. Go to the next slide. This one's all about resilience. I just put this in. It's not one of our standard slide deck photos, but certainly I just wanted to start this presentation off by acknowledging what a truly difficult time these last 16 months have been for all of our businesses. Everyone has been impacted in very different but remarkable ways as we look to recover. And so I know that no one could anticipate that this was going to hit us. And I know every single business has had to manage and adapt and time and then time again. I think we've said that it's almost COVID whiplash with the getting started, setting back and whatnot. So I think it's been a hard time. And so everyone deserves a little pat on the back for being able to get this far through this. And if you're one of those individuals that were brave enough to start a business in the middle of a pandemic, extra kudos to you, because we do want to make sure that you are supported in this region, and we do see all of you as business leaders, and we hope that you felt supported throughout this time. hopefully you are more resilient than you think you are. Next slide. And so again, we believe at PKED that with great effort and a great support team behind you, we are going to get over this next major hurdle that has completely turned our lives upside down. So next slide. So COVID disruption, certainly when January 2020 kicked off, we forecasted that growth was going to be one of our #1 challenges, as we anticipated strong migration from the GTA. And we had a brand new economic development strategy. It was called Future Ready. We talked about our key sectors, developing a workforce of the future, supporting entrepreneurs, and marketing this region as a destination of choice for business, startups, visitors, and students. And this strategy called for the need for innovation and sustainability, as well as the importance of working with partners for maximum effect to grow our economy. And that all sounded great. And then COVID happened. And then everything changed overnight. And it wasn't business as usual anymore. It was all about coping and trying to stay viable. And so it was incredible to see how interrelated everything was. Parents couldn't go to work because daycares and schools were closed, and yet orders for those businesses were still coming in, and they needed to still get out the door in order to be filled. And we definitely saw that it was a bit of feast and famine. That some businesses were struggling to stay open, while others were struggling to keep up with demand. And so we did learn a lot during this disruption. Simple things, how important washroom facilities are to the logistics sector and those truck drivers in particular when nothing was absolutely open. And so how important daycare industry was to industry. Downtown businesses were all of a sudden in the logistics game as they had to maneuver to do porch deliveries, and as they became more common. Retailers had to begin to run two separate businesses, their bricks and mortar, as well as their online retail store to stay alive. And then post-secondary institutions didn't deliver lectures in person anymore at a set time. They were recorded on a webinar and viewed whenever students had the time to actually see it. And so things were really disrupted. And again, from those of you who could work from home, you also and had children, you also had to figure out how to work and be a homeschool teacher at the same time. So everything pretty much changed, I think, as we all know. Nothing stayed the same. How we shopped, how we supported local, and how we actually communicated with everyone. It was a big change for everyone. On the next slide. And so the next question as we move into the economic recovery is, when will we get back to normal, the new normal, the next normal? Will it ever be normal, anything normal? And I think that has really been what we've been craving and obsessing about over the last several months. And I think especially as vaccination rates are starting to increase, we're starting to see that light at the end of the tunnel. But I still think we're in that position that I'm not aware of anyone yet who can actually answer that question to anyone's satisfaction on when it's going to get back to normal, if it ever does go back to what we call normal. When COVID first happened, the mayor of Peterborough and the warden of the county of Peterborough pulled together a mayor and warden's economic recovery task force. And economic development certainly played a role in trying to help coordinate that, as well as the rest of the economic development partners. We issued surveys, we made countless phone calls to businesses trying to understand the impacts of COVID for each business sector. We heard from every sector, from agriculture to manufacturing to retail to culinary and clean tech. We routinely had about 40 business leaders attending these roundtable calls. And we did create a 3-phase recovery plan that had that protect, restart, and then recover components. And of course, I think at that time, we didn't realize that we wouldn't move in a progressive line throughout those 3 phases. I think when we developed it is we would get to recover, we would get to restart, and then we would be in protect, and off we go. I think we were pretty naive at that point because we didn't realize that we would fluctuate between those 3 phases. And so what we also recognized is the pace of fluctuating between those 3 phases were very different depending on which sector you operated in. And so everyone's experience was unique, but yet similar. But I think everyone was equally frustrated at the end of the day. It was hard to hear, who is deemed essential, and some were very sadly stunned to find out that they weren't deemed essential. because I'm sure to them and their household, they very much were. And so at our task force meetings, we heard about these weekly challenges that the businesses were facing, and we did identify over about 50 challenges that were raised on a weekly basis. And I will give kudos at that time to both all levels of government who were trying to react to what those challenges were. But most of those 50 challenges were addressed at the provincial and the federal level through the various programs like the wage subsidy. But what we found were those were the same problems that every business in Ontario, every business in Canada were facing. And so it was appropriate that the province and the feds were taking the heavy lifting for dealing with those challenges. But I think as we dove deeper, we actually discovered that there were some challenges that were located that were specific to Peterborough and the Kawarthas region. Next slide. And so those four challenges that we identified that we need to focus on in order for us to become competitive as a region were workforce, available jobs, available land and buildings, and broadband. And then those four issues have certainly become the top priorities for us to work on in 2021, including our partners and our funders. Next slide. So under workforce, I've been talking a little bit about this lately. But it is unusual that we would have a community that does have higher unemployment, very low participation in the job market, and yet businesses are hiring and can't find workers. And so it's unusual that those three things would exist at the same time. And so it's clear that we have a critical skills gap to address, and businesses in all areas of the region are clamoring for people with skills, technical skills, as well as customer service and soft skills. People are searching for jobs, but they're not necessarily a good fit for what's needed by industry. And so we see a shift that's happening. And the New York Times just published an article on June 5th that discusses the workforce gaps and how companies are adapting. And I certainly see some of this happening here. It's interesting to see that companies are definitely willing to pay a little bit more, and they are having to show greater flexibility in where and how people work. I think as more people are used to this remote working, we're going to see more and more demands for that. But I think the big shift is that more and more companies are now willing to spend money to train their workers, that they're now having to take chances on people without the traditional qualifications that they would normally want to see. And so it is a shift that businesses are now in the training game, and managers are now more accountable for mentoring, developing, and building talent versus competing and trying to seek out and find that talent. And so in the Future Ready Economic Development Strategy, we talked about how jobs of the future haven't really been invented yet. We don't know where those jobs are going to be in the next 10 years. So it's really hard for post-secondary institutions to respond to the unknown and train for jobs that don't exist yet, which is leaving that gap for those businesses as they're trying to figure it out and teach those skills that are needed for their specific facility. The Future Ready strategy talks and works closely with Fleming College, Trent University, and Ontario Tech University to bring business to the table to talk about their current and future job requirements, so that all of those institutions are then able to create that talent pipeline for industry for this region. The buzzword is definitely micro credentials, and that's how we're finding our way to bridge that gap and support our local companies through micro credential development. The next slide. This one's available land and buildings, and so it's no secret that we're a little tight for new development and new investment in this region. There are limited lands that are zoned within the city for employment uses, and those lands that are zoned for employment in the county are not necessarily serviced with the right services with water, sewer, natural gas, and fiber, or they might be located in environmentally sensitive areas that are not suitable for development because they were designated for employment, 40, 50 years ago before we knew better. So we're still trying to understand the changes from COVID, how many businesses will continue to offer remote working. Will large employers in those huge office towers in the major cities, will they want to create those little smaller hubs in smaller and mid-sized communities like Peterborough, where some of their employees are working? Are there greater opportunities for those mid-sized cities to take advantage of that now that people have had a taste of not commuting? There might be some resistance to go back to that every day. And so to counter that, Peterborough and the Kawarthas Economic Development, we're working with city and county staff as they develop their next edition of their official plans. And that's really to plan for growth, create those employment areas, and then respond to business needs for now and in the future. And so it's critical that we continue to advocate and push for strong competitive locations that are designated for employment where businesses want to be. Next slide. I love this photo to explain broadband because I feel like this is how it has been over the last few years, the last 16 months. Our calls are jammed. Everybody is fighting for bandwidth. And I think COVID has proven how necessary this infrastructure truly is. There's a lot of great work that is being undertaken behind the scenes with the Eastern Ontario Regional Network, or EORN, to improve broadband capacity in Eastern Ontario. And they're doing a ton of work for us. We know that we are a desired community to live in, and if we had that high-speed gigabit broadband that EORN is advocating and trying to build out, we certainly would be far more attractive to remote workers in this region. Next slide. Also wanted to talk about downtowns and the health of downtowns. I have long said that downtowns are definitely the heartbeat of any community. Many businesses in their relocation decisions will assess the health of an economy and the health of a community by assessing its downtown. And so it's critical that ours is vibrant and engaging. And downtowns, though, are changing, and COVID was particularly difficult on downtowns, and not just Peterborough's, on every downtown in the province. I think as office workers worked remotely and restaurants and cafes were closed, they were only closed for takeout only. It was good to see now that we see those patios that they're opening back up, and they are starting to breathe some much needed life back into the core. But despite some of those challenges, our downtown is actually coveted by many communities. And it is because we're leading with the strength of our culinary sector in the downtown. The DBIA has launched a new strategic plan that aspires to be known for exceptional experiences for high-end retail, a place for startups and technology-based entrepreneurs. It's going to be a place for grassroots artisans and diverse cuisine and entertainment. So downtowns are that space for small and medium-sized businesses, those independents and those entrepreneurs. So it is critical to continue to support those business owners, and the new strategy for the DBIA, it is a good one. The next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about tourism because it is a key sector in this region. And as the tourism industry has been hit particularly hard by COVID-19, it's been hard as an agency that is responsible for tourism because we don't get to do what comes natural to us. We normally would be trying to welcome over 3 million visitors to this region, promoting our authentic adventures, day trips, weekend getaway plans, and of course, marketing to cyclists and artists and music enthusiasts, paddlers, and so it's weird when we're not able to do that. Those visitors spend about $300 million in our local community each year, and so we definitely are anxious to get back to that. Next slide. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the Tourism Resiliency Fund, and because of those tough times that our tourism businesses were facing, we were grateful to receive funding from FedDev, which allowed us to partner with Community Futures Peterborough to deliver grants to tourism-dependent businesses in our region to help them stay on their feet. And as you can imagine, the need was substantial. We were definitely oversubscribed to the program, but we were able to provide funding to 54 businesses in our region, anywhere from $2,500 up to $20,000 to help offset costs for long-term solutions and improvements to fight COVID-19 and help keep their businesses open and safe. So many of those patios in the downtown, or if you've noticed that some of the businesses now have new technology, that businesses have adopted. They have new cleaning systems in our hotels. Patio heaters have been purchased just to extend and keep their livelihood going. So again, that was part of our overall recovery plan to help our tourism businesses. Next slide. We also recognized that in summer, we really don't need to do an awful lot of marketing to promote the destination in the summer. People know us, they find us, and those 3 million visitors, we can't fit much more in the summertime. And so what we need to do is, in order to strengthen and grow the tourism sector, we need to start looking at growing winter and shoulder season. We need to encourage visitors to come here for all of the seasons, not just the summer. And I think there's a lot of great examples globally that we can pull from to see where we can do and grow that sector a little bit more. Next slide. Um, I will start with culinary because next to accommodations, food and beverage are the next biggest expenditure list for our visitors. And so it was very nice that in 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, we were selected as one of 4 destinations in the country to work with the Culinary Tourism Alliance and the Tourism Industry Association of Canada on a national project called Elevating Canadian Experiences. And so we are a well respected destination at both the provincial and federal level when it comes to tourism. And so we were really pleased to work on this pilot project. But what we received in return was a 3-year strategy to help build out our culinary tourism offering, incorporating our agriculture businesses and producers. We definitely have a great story to tell, and we'll be launching a series of culinary packages to entice visitors throughout the winter and shoulder season. So stay tuned for some of those. Next slide. In business development, we have kicked off the 2nd year of our annual business count survey. So if you are a business operating in this region, please make sure that you answer our surveyors when they give you a call and call on you. This really is an economic development and planning tool that we started. Again, not the best time to launch a business count in the middle of a pandemic, but what we wanted to do was assess the number of businesses, the number of employees on a full-time, part-time, and seasonal basis, as well as the square footage that businesses are operating in each sector. And the reason why we're trying to do that is to understand where growth is happening and making sure that we're in line with the growth plan that the province has set out for us and that we're achieving those targets. And we know through our Future Ready economic development strategy that we are going to be responsible for creating about 14,000 jobs over this next planning horizon period. And so we need to make sure that we're ready and that we're able to count these jobs. And so that's been a very important project that, again, this is our 2nd year of this, but something that we hope to do annually. We're also participating with Ontario East Economic Development Commission and their foreign direct investment project to help attract global companies to this region through Ontario East. We continue to focus on clean technology through Clean Tech Commons, aerospace through the airport, agriculture to improve aggregation and distribution centers and for local producers. And then we're also working with the Kawartha Manufacturers Association to help address significant workforce development challenges that we have. Next slide. In the Business Advisory Center, entrepreneurship is going to be an important driver for us in the economy in 2021. We know every time there is a reset and a major disruption in the world, entrepreneurship always plays a strong role as part of recovery. So it's great that our Business Advisory Center and the Innovation Cluster are able to continue to support those entrepreneurs getting started. So we'll continue to offer our Starter Company Plus program. We have intake going on right now. We'll offer our Summer Company program, which is also in place right now. That's an entrepreneurship program for youth. And then again, we pivoted and have our new venture sessions, our business fundamental workshops, and we've also converted to e-learning system so that people can take advantage of our e-learning courses at a time and place that's convenient for you. Next slide. I think just to close off with recovering and rebuilding, it was a very difficult 2020 and a very rocky start to 2021. We still have a lot of unknowns. We do see some positive news though. Vaccine rates are going up, infection rates are going down. I'm hearing that a little rumor that Canada may be the first country to reach that herd immunity. So I feel that we're starting to hear those plans of events being planned for the fall. So I think we're starting to be in that positive place. And I think as an economic development agency, we are starting to see more and more calls and inquiries coming in. So we know that we're still a destination of interest and that several companies, we are on their radar. So we weren't on them before. And so it's nice to see that things are starting to pick back up and moving forward despite all of the uncertainty that we have today. So I do anticipate that the rest of 2021 is still going to be that period of protecting and recovering. But I do think working with our partners that we are definitely ready to do that and take on the next phase. So next slide is thank you, and happy to answer any questions if that's appropriate, or wait till the end.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. We really, really appreciate that. I think if you're okay, maybe we'll just wait to the end and we'll get right into Andrew's presentation, because I do think that there's probably going to be some questions prompted by Andrew's presentation that very well could tie back obviously to yours as well. So I get to the honor of introducing Andrew Pyle. Andrew's actually our newest board member as well at the Innovation Cluster, and so he's joined our volunteer board, which we're really, really excited to have access to him and some of his insight that he brings to the table. For the last 25 years, Andrew's held several senior marketing analyst positions in Canada's financial industry sector. He's constantly advising clients, businesses, charity organizations on financial issues. Prior to joining Scotia McLeod, which he's obviously a portfolio manager and branch manager there today, he was the vice president and head of capital markets for Scotia Economics. Many of us have seen him locally on Checks TV delivering the economic report, but he's also seen and quoted across the country in a number of media organizations. He's constantly appearing on regularly scheduled both radio and TV shows. And he's often asked to speak to groups such as ours. And so we're really, really happy to have Andrew Pyle join us today. And Andrew, over to you, but welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you to the cluster. Thank you to obviously Peterborough Economic Development for giving me this opportunity again to present to you this morning. I think it was 14 months to the day, Mike, that I last presented to this group. And that was a month after global stock markets had hit rock bottom, at a time that all of us were introduced to something that I don't think any of us ever learned in university or in college in our textbooks, and that was, how do you create a forced shutdown of an economy around the world? And depending on who you talk to, we're either lucky to be alive and amazed that medical technology has put vaccines in the arms of billions of people, or we've set ourselves on a course for further challenges down the road. And today, I'm hoping that I can shed a little bit more light on that future. Okay. So I think, where I want to start this morning is there really has been no other period in memory or in the last century that has created the volatility in both the economy and financial markets as in the past 15 months. And what we've seen is obviously this unprecedented forced economic shutdown due to COVID-19. And, if you think back to the Great Recession of 2008, which, is becoming fleeting memory, but still wasn't that long ago, 13, 14 years ago, that was the worst global contraction in the world economy, basically since the Great Depression. The contraction in the world economy and the following recovery that we have witnessed during this pandemic dwarfs even that period of time that at the time we thought was incredible. And you can see that on the chart in terms of the swings that we saw in terms of the contraction last year in the second quarter, and obviously the immediate rebound that we saw in the third quarter. Most economists right now predict continued strong growth in global GDP, at least through the second half this year. But I think most economists will agree that we will start to see that pace of growth slow down in subsequent years as we go into a period of more sustainable, but obviously less intense economic activity. And if we kind of look at North America in the second quarter of last year, the US economy actually contracted by 31%. Again, testimony to this just unprecedented swing in activity. In the subsequent quarter, we saw the US economy actually rebound by 33%. Here in Canada, actually this volatility was even greater. In the second quarter of last year, we saw the economy shrink by about 38%. And then we saw a fantastic 42% expansion in the economy in the third quarter. After continued strong growth in Q4 of last year and the first quarter of this year, the US economy now has more than recovered all of the lost ground from the pandemic. And I think that is what's truly startling. I know when we were talking last year around this time, it was really the uncertainty about if we did get a rebound, how lasting would it be? How long would it take for the economy, especially in the States or Canada, to recoup all of that lost ground? And would in fact we kind of find ourselves in things like a double dip recession, which obviously did not happen. Canada, however, we were still 2% below our pre-pandemic level of output in the economy as of the first quarter. And unfortunately, we expect the second quarter numbers that will be appearing in a few weeks to show another contraction, unfortunately, and that obviously has to do with the lockdowns that we've seen in several regions of Canada. And of course, this is being backed up by a lot of the information that we're tracking, whether it's employment or consumer spending. The good news is that we think that this second quarter blip or dip in economic activity in Canada is going to be short-lived. I do expect that we'll see a rebound as we get into the summer. In terms of jobs, and I know Rhonda was talking about this in her comments, it's been hugely challenging for businesses and individuals. And one of the good things, again, going back to the third quarter of last year, is that we did see a very substantial snapback in North American employment, whether we're looking at US non-farm payrolls or Canadian employment. And that rebound really lasted into 2021. Again, however, with the lockdown-led declines that we've seen here in Canada, employment in April and May fell. And right now we're about 3% below the pre-pandemic peak in Canadian employment. And that's a gap of about 570,000 jobs. That, believe it or not, even with this pullback that we've seen this quarter in Canada, that's still better than the United States. The US right now is about 5% below where it was before the pandemic hit, or the equivalent of around 7.5 million payroll positions. Now, one of the concerns that we have now, and again, going back to Rhonda's comments, is that we have this mismatch between staffing requirements by businesses and the availability of labor. And there's been a lot of views and theories expressed on this. So some of this has been attributed to generous unemployment supplements from the government. It's been attributed to concerns that people may still have over returning to work because of the virus, or lack of women returning to work because of the lack of daycare for children where schools are closed. I think we'll know a lot more about this as we get into September, because obviously by September, we will start to see some of these supplemental programs diminish. Vaccines, again, the rollout has been truly incredible, and you would think logically that as this vaccine rollout proceeds, we get closer and closer to herd immunity, people will feel more comfortable going back to work. So we do think that labor participation will start to improve, and that will feed again into a continued recovery in jobs. And at some point in the not too distant future, I do believe that both Canada and the States, we will be back to our pre-pandemic levels of employment. Now, the rescue from the government side of things did not come without a price tag. When the Obama administration ran deficits close to about $1.5 trillion after the financial crisis, some believe that it would take a miracle to bring that deficit back and to balance the books, like the US did in the late 1990s. In actual fact, they came close, but the closest we got to a balanced budget in the States was a deficit of around $500 billion as we move further and further into recovery. Today, based on available data, that deficit in the United States is pushing $3 trillion, and that does not include measures that are working their way through Washington as we speak. The Congressional Budget Office now expects a deficit to be trimmed to around $1 trillion in a couple of years. I don't believe that forecast, but that's the official forecast currently. And that's based on obviously stronger economic growth and a sharp reduction in rescue measures. However, when you start looking at economic growth moderating, which the CBO does expect, it actually projects that that deficit will expand back to close to $2 trillion 10 years from now. So again, if we thought it was hard to get back to a balanced budget in the United States after the financial crisis, even the CBO today is admitting that it's pretty much impossible to get to that position after this pandemic enforced shutdown. Canada has obviously not been left out of the deficit party. As much as investors wanted to see some clue in government projections that we would be on a trajectory towards the balanced budget after the massive fiscal deficits that we saw last year, the latest federal budget didn't show that. Based on budget projections themselves, total federal government debt will reach 1.4 trillion in 5 years' time. And last year was a milestone because last year was the first time that total federal debt in this country exceeded $1 trillion. And even the most pessimistic forecasts over the last several years did not show a debt of this magnitude, as we turn the corner into 2020 and 2021. Now, a ton of history books are going to be written about the economic impact of the pandemic and how governments responded. And there will be passing grades and there will be failing grades. But there appears to me to be a consensus that unprecedented fiscal support was in fact necessary. Now, those history books, I think, are going to be a little bit more divided on whether or not governments were successful in finding austerity when it was needed. And inevitably, the markets will again be judge and jury in terms of whether they were successful or not. So if governments, basically pulled out cloned rabbits during this pandemic recovery, central banks put to rest any argument over how many rabbits were in their toolkits. In the financial crisis, we were introduced to near zero official interest rates for both Canada and the United States. And it took less than a month last year for the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve to drop their key rates back down near zero. So the response by central banks at the beginning of the pandemic was unprecedented, not in terms of where rates went, but it was unprecedented in terms of the speed with which central banks got there. In other words, there was no wasting of time. It was an immediate rescue effort, at least in terms of the rates cycle. A decade ago, we were also introduced to this concept of quantitative easing or central bank bond buying, whereby central banks literally go into the open market and buy quantities of, in the beginning, government bonds, but now that has expanded to buying mortgage-backed securities, and even in this last cycle, the bonds of corporations. And both the Bank of Canada and the Fed saw a sizable expansion in their own balance sheets. We saw that back after the financial crisis. We never really saw a major pullback in the balance sheets, but we did see a slowing of the pace of expansion. What the pandemic did was create quantitative easing on steroids. And we're now looking at balance sheets that are beyond, again, what even quantitative proponents thought were possible. So if you look at the chart, you'll see, US Federal Reserve assets now up close to $8 trillion. Bank of Canada assets had approached $600 billion. We've seen a little bit of a pullback. Now, similar to fiscal policy, there were a few that argued against extraordinary measures taken by central banks to backstop financial markets and ensure that there was ample liquidity to prevent an economic train wreck. The Bank of Canada has been trimming back its balance sheet. It's actually reduced it by about 10%. But it looks to me as though that the Bank of Canada is now reconsidering how much more it wants to pull back, especially in light of weaker economic conditions that we saw come out of the second quarter. For the Federal Reserve, the last FOMC meeting, which was last week, hinted that a modest tapering of bond purchases might be in the cards, possibly before the end of the year. But the Fed learned its lesson back in 2013 when it started talking prematurely about cutting bond purchases, and that became what we now know as the taper tantrum of 2013. I think still it's important to distinguish between reducing accommodation, like cutting back bond purchases or raising rates back to maybe something close to neutral, and distinguishing that from monetary policy tightening. So I think whenever we talk about the Fed kind of pulling back a bit or the Bank of Canada pulling back, people kind of immediately fear that we're going into tightening mode, when in fact all we're really doing is just reducing accommodation, or if you want to put it another way, it's like taking your foot off the gas pedal, but you haven't really started hitting the brake pedal yet. And I think, if we were getting into a tightening position by central banks, that actually would entail reducing the balance sheet as opposed to just simply tapering back purchases and it would mean moving interest rates above neutral. Neither of those two developments, in my opinion, look to be in the cards anytime soon. The other important thing to keep in mind as we worked our way through the pandemic from these two channels of economic rescue, both government and central banks, is that there's been a convergence of these policies in a period where demand had been depressed. So we all know, I'm sure, of folks that have bought the last Sea-Doo in the store or the last ATV on the lot, but these consumer discretionary items are a small share of overall consumer spending. As for business spending, fewer companies have wanted to stretch their necks out too far with an economic outlook that still carries a lot of uncertainty. And so bottom line, there's been an accumulation of savings or accumulation of cash, both at the consumer level and I would argue also at the business level. And we've seen a tremendous amount of net savings by households and reduced demand for credit. So if you look at the US banking sector right now, overall, we're sitting on almost $7 trillion in excess liquidity. Now, this is cash that will eventually find a home. It has been finding a home of late in purchases of government bonds on the balance sheet. But it will also find a home eventually in terms of increased lending, in other words, credit expansion. It'll find a home in terms of dividend increases or even share buybacks. And this week, regulators announced that banks in the States had easily passed their capital stress tests. So I think that window is definitely opening up in terms of the latter two, at least, dividend increases and obviously share buybacks. But like water, cash eventually does find a home. If it's not going to find it through spending, then it will find its way into other assets and assets, for example, like stocks. The TSX hit a record closing high just shy of 18,000 on February 19th of last year. And on March 23rd, it closed at 11,228. This January, the TSX closed above 18,000, where we were basically in February of last year before all hell broke loose. And today we're above 20,000. So I think, first of all, a little perspective is useful. Before the financial crisis, the TSX peaked in June 2008 at just over 15,000. After losing half of its value, it wouldn't see those heights again for 6 years. And the story was similar for the broader US market. After hitting rock bottom in March of last year, the S&P 500 returned to its pre-pandemic record high in, believe it or not, just 5 months. Today, the S&P 500 is up more than 25% from its pre-pandemic peak, and it's up roughly 90% from its trough in March. Now, some believe that equity markets have become overly expensive and are due for a major correction. And of course, as we talk to people, anything is possible. But outside of normal minor hiccups, like we have seen basically since the start of the rally last year, the array of major obstacles seems minor. The caveat obviously would be something pertaining to the virus. If we were to see a variant or variants that somehow evaded the vaccines that we currently have in our arsenal, yeah, that would be a game changer. But I think most people believe that even the odds of that happening are slowly beginning to dissipate. Another thing to keep in mind, just from a historical point of view, is that 14 months into the recovery after the financial crisis, the S&P 500 was also up close to 90%, almost over the exact same time period that we've seen the similar rebound this time around. And if you look back, people then thought that things had gone too far. But if it hadn't been for Greece and the Euro crisis, which culminated in 2010, took us into 2012, the rally probably would have kept going. And even still, a few years later, the S&P 500 was still up more than 160% and continued to improve. When I last presented to this group back in the third week of April last year, the NASDAQ 100 had already recovered half of its loss since the bottom that it reached in March. By the first week of June, the index had completely recovered and was back to hitting new record highs, breaking above the psychological barrier of 10,000. Now, again, a little bit of history. Consider that it took the NASDAQ 100 about 13 years to recover all of the value lost after the tech bubble implosion of 2000 to 2002. It only took 5 years after that to double its value, and that was with a pandemic. Again, year-over-year comparables are important to keep in mind. this time last year, businesses and individuals were racing out to buy equipment and services to allow for remote working, to say nothing of the school system. If we were in the same place in terms of the pandemic as we were a year ago, fact of the matter is that individuals and companies would not have to keep going out and buying the same volume of technology. You don't have to buy a new laptop once every year unless you really want to. You only have to upgrade your bandwidth because kids are gaming is messing, and that's messing up with your daytime Netflix binge watching. But you only really have to do that once as well. At some point, the pace of buying in these areas was going to wane, no different than online shopping might slip as a little as people start going back to the stores. So some tech segments, in my opinion, will continue to flourish as they always have, but some are not going to. People will always want the latest phone, and they might be tempted to get the latest MacBook, but again, not at the frenzied pace that we saw literally 12 months ago. The same time, and I think this is key as we look forward and start thinking about technology. I mean, it's not going to be the same kind of broad technology argument as before, but there's going to be greater demand for things like cybersecurity, especially in the wake of hacks and breaches that have occupied the media in recent weeks. Technology related to electric vehicles and clean energy production will also see increased demand. So what I'm saying is that we're probably leaving a world where any tech works to one where there will be winners, and the number of winners probably will shrink relative to the numbers of losers just because of this shift away from broader tech. Again, when I spoke to this group last year, we had just witnessed something remarkable and again, unprecedented. Oil futures had actually turned negative, which again, I can't tell you how many calls I fielded by people just wanting to know what that even meant. Briefly, of course, but prices were already in moderation mode even before the pandemic shutdown. So we'll say that last year, the real floor, outside of that negative experience was around $20 for crude futures. Today, we've climbed up to above $70 a barrel in terms of futures, and analysts now are pushing and shoving their way towards forecasts of $80 and some even in terms of $100 a barrel. In a recovering economy, these estimates are not out of line, but we also have to be mindful of a few developments that are taking place irrespective of the pandemic. First, Russia now needs a little bit more revenue, given that there's increased offense by the US and its European allies in terms of coordination. Russia has recently called for the OPEC Plus group of nations to begin expanding oil production. So that will obviously potentially mean more supply. There's also a chance that we will get a reworked Iran nuclear agreement. And if that happens, that would allow the country to increase its exports from depressed levels that obviously came into being when the agreement or the previous agreement was thrown out the window. And then there are US shale producers who are now much more profitable thanks to oil that's above $60 a barrel. So for all of those reasons, I don't believe we will see $100 on oil, even though the economy of the world continues to recover. The other more longer term argument against higher oil prices is that alternative energy bus has left the station. I started working here in Peterborough about 14 years ago, and some days that feels like yesterday. Well, in 14 years, General Motors, Ford, and other automakers have committed to selling only electric vehicles. And that day will be here sooner than what we expect, and it will feel like a blur. But we've got a long way to go on that, and a ton of infrastructure improvement that needs to take place. But peak oil, I would say right now, has probably been replaced with peak demand growth. In terms of excess liquidity, we also saw that showing up in the demand for housing in the middle of what can be considered to be massive supply disruptions. The end result was an exacerbated shortage of key building materials, including lumber. And that's why we saw lumber futures hit record highs this spring. Those highs, again, if you look at the chart, incredible in the context of where we were even before the financial crisis or the housing crisis of 2008, 2009. Lumber future prices were 4 times the peak that we saw prior to that crisis. But this has also contributed to inflation anxiety in financial markets, and we've seen in recent weeks now an equally stunning pullback in lumber prices, although we're still well above levels that we've seen towards the end of last year. Now, even though we've seen signs of increased home building out in the rural parts of Canada, there's obviously been a exodus, for lack of a better word, of individuals from the urban centers towards areas like this, which has been obviously fantastic for us. But the overall level of construction really hasn't kept pace with demand. And then with higher building costs and ridiculously high permit fees, contributing to this, we have this exacerbated supply-demand imbalance. The result's been the highest pace of new home price inflation since before the financial crisis. And right now, new home price inflation in Canada is roughly around 11%. Now, that's not yet back to the late 1980s, but if you think back to reports at the start of the pandemic, a lot of experts were suggesting that Canada's housing sector was going to suffer. We'd be in malaise. Against that backdrop, I would argue the statistics today are truly remarkable. The good news is that the supply-demand imbalance in housing is going to alleviate. Construction will expand thanks partly to a reduction in building costs, and existing home listings will actually begin to rise even more as homeowners now become more confident in showing their homes. One of the concerns that we have is that we may already have created a bit of a housing bubble in Canada. And again, this seems to occupy the media more and more and more. Mortgage levels right now for a lot of Canadians are excessive in some regions. And that's going to make homeowners a little bit more vulnerable, or a lot more vulnerable, to rising interest rates. Another way to analyze the current situation, if you look at the chart that I've just put up, is by comparing home prices to rents. So the OECD produces a really interesting stat that looks at the ratio of home prices, or the home price index, to the rent index. And again, if we went back to the late 1980s, it was back then considered to be excessive. We had a ratio of just close to 60%. And after that, we actually entered a housing recession that was quite extensive, and it lasted until roughly the mid-1990s. On the chart, you'll see that that ratio today is about 140%. So given that, I think it's only natural to assume that as we work our way through the summer and into the second half, you probably will hear more individuals coming out on the negative side of the equation, saying that, again, look, we're in a housing bubble. And again, it's possible that we are. I think it'll be more regional as opposed to Canada-wide. There are going to be areas, I think, that are going to be somehow protected. And fortunately, I think that's the area that we're in currently. Getting back to inflation, the May CPI reports grabbed the headlines, both Canada and the States. Here we saw annual inflation hit 3.6%. That was the highest in exactly 10 years. South of the border, inflation reached 5%. And believe it or not, that was the highest since right before the Great Recession of 08-09. For those of you that have been shocked by the jump in inflation this quarter, again, we have to keep in mind what was happening this time last year. So in May of last year, CPI inflation was actually minus 0.4%, and inflation in the United States was 0.1%. So remember back in April of last year when gasoline prices were 80 cents or lower per liter, how do you like them today? But the main thing is we're dealing with year-over-year comparables to an extremely depressed period. So it's completely natural to see things like inflation getting to very, very lofty levels, or levels that we haven't seen for a while. It's important to look beyond the base effects, which again are distorting where things really are today, and imagine where prices inflation will be in the months and quarters to come. This is exactly the task at hand for central banks, and why the US Federal Reserve has gone out of its way to convince businesses, consumers, and investors that this inflationary spike is going to be transitory. The extreme forecast 2 years ago that North American central banks would have to reduce official rates to negative territory, and I think a lot of you will remember, again, pre-pandemic calls from even the White House for the Federal Reserve to go to negative territory, like Japan, like Europe. Those calls proved incorrect after all, even with a devastating pandemic and sharp contraction in economic activity. Now, that's not to say it'll never happen, but I think we've dodged that bullet for now. Both the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve are likely to raise rates by the time we get to 2023. And this would be a much shorter time frame from the last rate cut for the Fed than we saw after the financial crisis. But to be quite honest, if you look at the chart and over the last several decades, you know, we typically have had very short periods of time between the last rate cut and the first rate hike. So assuming that we do get some type of interest rate increases towards the end of 2023 or in the middle of 2023, really that's not going to be out of the ordinary in terms of previous cycles. The Bank of Canada actually, after the last financial crisis, raised rates before all other central banks or major central banks. It did so literally about a year after the trough. It turned out that it regretted that move later. We had to backpedal in Canada because we actually created conditions for weaker economic activity. So I obviously get asked a lot where rates are heading when they finally do lift off. And the only thing that I believe is pretty certain is that we don't get back to where we were, or we don't get back much above where we were before the pandemic. And again, if you take a look at the chart, each progressive economic cycle, with the exception of 2000, saw lower peaks for the Federal Reserve key rates. And I think this time around is going to be interesting. And mainly because if you look at consumer credit right now, it hasn't ballooned in the United States as much as you might think. Reason for that is because of government support in the form of fiscal checks. In fact, the year before the pandemic, a measure of consumer credit multiplied by the Fed's fund rate was smaller than in 2007. The trick here, of course, is the uptake in employment or lack thereof, especially once the support checks run out. In other words, if consumers remain in spending mode because of the reopening, and there is a smaller gain in employment and incomes, then one would assume that consumer credit growth is going to re-accelerate in the States, and I would argue the same thing will happen in Canada. So even if the Fed merely takes its official rate back to where it was at the start of 2020, or in other words, before the pandemic, and that rate for the Fed was about 2.5%, or was 2.5%, we will actually see a higher share of household budgets going to paying debt servicing costs. And again, this whole analysis ignores, in my opinion, the real elephant in the room, and that is the government. So for those of you with long memories, you'll remember that Canada hit a wall back in the 1990s because of the share of government expenditures going to debt service payments, and the fact that that share became so large that it created what we call a structural deficit situation that drew the ire of foreign investors and also credit rating agencies. At the peak, we were spending about $50 billion in Canada simply on servicing the debt. Now, thanks to relative control over the budget and a secular decline in interest rates, that number dropped to around $20 billion by 2017. The problem now is that the federal debt is projected to rise to $1.4 trillion in only 5 years. At that level, an expenditure of $50 billion would imply an average borrowing rate of around 3.5%. Now, people listen to that and they'll say, well, that doesn't really matter, because if I look at the average bond yield in Canada right now from, say, 2 years to 30 years, that average now is only about 1.1%. Problem, though, is if the 2-year bond were to rise back to levels that we saw only back in 2018, which was around 2.3%, and let's assume for now the yield curve holds its shape, that average borrowing cost now can start moving out to 3%. And all of that assumes inflation doesn't get out of hand, as some suggest it could. And if that were the case, it would result in obviously a more aggressive tightening move by the US, and that would entail a more aggressive tightening in Canada. So the reason we need to be mindful of that period is that businesses finally found themselves facing an erosion back in the 1990s in the Canadian dollar, and eventually higher short-term interest rates. And so when I speak to people today, that risk, albeit a medium-term risk, definitely needs to be part of business planning going forward. But just to wrap it up, because I'm mindful of everyone's time, for businesses out there that are trying to plan in these uncertain times, I think it does help to maybe split the economic and market outlook into two. Near term, it's unlikely that policy decisions will be made that will derail this train. Again, as I mentioned before, the virus does remain a threat, and it's entirely possible that, again, variants could emerge that upsets the apple cart. And again, I think that threat is diminishing, but it's still there. And the fact that it's diminishing is a reason why investors are still very much positive on the near-term outlook. And we're close, to things that we never thought we'd see before. Yesterday was announced that we probably will have a bipartisan bill on U.S. infrastructure. I mean, who knew that people in Washington could get along? But it's been a long time since we've heard the word bipartisan and agreement in the same sentence. But the fact that it's happening obviously is welcome news to businesses trying to plan. It's obviously welcome news to the markets. There are some geopolitical risks, of course. There's a potential escalation in tensions between the U.S. and China, and that can't be ruled out, just like the virus. But again, I think that risk also appears to be fairly minimal over the short term, given the political landscape in Washington. Again, the real risks, in my opinion, for business owners really are kind of down the road. So whether we're saying 3 years or 5 years, maybe a little bit longer. And I'm not saying that inflation gets away from us, even with the magnitude of liquidity in the system and pent-up demand. But if you believe the global economy is going to improve, then logic dictates that interest rates will rise and borrowing costs will start to eat into household and government budgets. The one thing I will say is that this economic cycle is unlikely to match the duration of the last one. The main reason is that last year's recession, as short-lived as it was created. And perhaps given time, the economy would have come to a halt simply because of the rise in interest rates, and that consumption spending growth would have eventually abated. And we tricked ourselves out of a longer recession or double dip because of the extraordinary policy measures that were taken. But unless we buy into maintaining those measures, the laws of economic physics will prevail, and traditional headwinds probably will emerge. And again, that could be in 3 years, 5 years, or 7 years. That's good news for businesses over the near term. But I do think we have to start thinking in terms of what happens if this cycle is more normal, because a more normal economic cycle is closer to 5 years, not 10. So I would say, to sum things up, we can call this year a bit of a warm-up, if you think. But based on what I've seen, I think Canadian businesses and companies in this region responded extremely well, and I think are well prepared for the challenges going forward. And again, Mike, I know we've gone over time, so I'll wrap it up there. But if anyone does have any questions, definitely put it through to Mike, and I will answer them.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, so we do have the Q&A enabled on the system. So Andrew, thank you very much for your great speech as always. Extremely informative, and I always come away thinking I know less than I started with, but I really appreciate it. You've definitely given us a lot of insight for sure. I'd like to open it up now to questions both for Rhonda or Andrew, and you can address them to either or both in some cases. And we have turned on the Q&A if anybody wants to ask some questions. Well, while people are just kind of putting their questions together, maybe I'll sort of pose a question to both of you. Obviously, Andrew, you've been in our community now for 14 years. You're well tied into the community in many different places. Do you look at Peterborough as being a microeconomy of the macroeconomy of Canada, or do you think that there are some very unique differences that are tied into Peterborough that don't necessarily follow the trends necessarily the rest of the country does?
It's a good question, Mike. And I remember my days back at economic development, and back then it was how do we make Canada unique? and back then, I was kind of facetious in saying that I think Peterborough, or how do we make Peterborough unique? I said, I think it's already unique, but maybe not for the best reasons. I would say right now, I think Peterborough is unique, and I think it's good not to be a microcosm of the overall economy. I think it'd be nicer not to be a microcosm and to be something different and something leading. And I think, everything I've seen, whether it's through the cluster, everything you guys have been doing, the people that are being attracted to this area, and I think we've kind of accelerated or hit the acceleration button in terms of people wanting to be here. And of course, like even myself, before I started living in the Peterborough area, didn't really know much about the area, didn't know what it had to offer. I didn't know what, talent there was here. So I just now multiply that by all the people that are emerging from the centers and looking at what's here. So I think I think we're going to enter a renaissance period, Mike, for this area. I think we will be different than the macro economy, and I think that's a good thing. And I do think that this is going to be kind of a magnet for talent and a lot of the technologies that we're producing.
I agree. That's good to hear for sure. Another quick question for you that came in. For early stage startups, do you think there's going to be a shortage in venture capital funding in the next little while?
I don't think so. I think, again, back to my liquidity issue, there is so much liquidity in the system right now, it has to find a home. Now, some of that liquidity finds a home in bad places like GameStop. But a lot of that liquidity is looking for earnings, long-term earnings, which you're going to find from companies. So I think private equity, capital availability, Mike, I think it's going to be sound. I think companies are not going to have a problem tapping into that.
That's great to hear. That's good to hear. Rhonda, this question's for you. So in conversation with employers, are you hearing difficulties getting staff back to work and due part to the government subsidies and incentives to obviously to compensate for staying at home?
That's a great question. And I think it really is a combination of depending on the sector. I think in some of those service-oriented jobs that are primarily female-oriented that are taking those jobs, we're definitely hearing that some of those incentives and subsidies are helping individuals stay comfortable at home, but then there's also the challenge of daycare where it may not be just the subsidy, it might just be the situation that they're in, that they're not able to go back to work. In the sectors like manufacturing, I think there's a longer standing gap in skills. I know that, and I think it's not just related to Peterborough. I think this is bigger than just Peterborough manufacturing sector, but millwright, CNC operators, engineers are in short supply, and they have been in short supply prior to the pandemic, and I think that will continue on. So I think those skills are something that we need to work on and try to attract. And there's some good programs out there right now, but again, it's the two worlds depending on the sector.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So I've got two more. One's actually a comment. This is more for you, Rhonda, but just a comment, just letting you know that we are loving the great downtown job with the patios, the extensions, and the way the structure is put in place. But a number of people would like to know if when things get back to whatever normal is this something that we can hope to see downtown with those patio extensions and things like that?
I hope so. I was on one last night and I quite enjoyed it, so I hope they're here to stay.
I agree as well. Andrew, last question for you, just about thoughts on the housing boom. Do you think we're going to lose more young workers due to the housing prices in our region? Or do you think that's just a blip? Obviously, we've seen huge numbers in Canada, but we've also seen large numbers in Peterborough because of the migration from Toronto. So you think that's going to drive away some of our younger workers?
It's entirely possible, Mike. And I mean, of course, good and bad things happen. I mean, we have the 407 right now, which provides a nice conduit between this region and the GTA. The risk is that you can create a bedroom community very easy if you have the wrong economic fundamentals going on, and that would apply also to housing. But I think, and that's why it comes back to being able to really stimulate job growth here and having high paying jobs, high quality jobs for trained people and educated people, because that's how you defeat that obstacle. I think things will slow down a bit, and I had a chat with somebody the other day about like just this explosion in demand for property here by people in the city, and I'm sure a lot of these people, once they're here, will stay, whether or not they work here or not. Maybe they work in GTA, but they just want to live here because they want to be away from the tightness of Toronto. I personally think that dissipates as the pandemic eases, as we become more immune to this. And I think you may find some people not liking to be here. It takes too long to drive to the opera. So I think there's maybe a slight ebbing of this wave at some point. Not huge. I wouldn't be worried about it from a housing point of view, but I do think the job is here. We've got to get people employed with higher skilled jobs, and that way they won't go back to the GTA. I think it's imperative right now for government and policymakers.
It makes a lot of sense. Rhonda, do you want to maybe add anything to that piece, and then we'll wrap it up?
No, I think Andrew summed it up just beautifully. I agree completely.
Good. Well, maybe we get an opera here as well, then we'll be able to keep everybody there for sure. Excellent. Well, I'd just like to thank everyone for participating. We had a great number of people coming from actually around the world in some cases. We launched a startup visa program at the Innovation Cluster about 6 months ago, and so we're on our second cohort of international companies, and I saw a number of their names participating. So those are individuals are coming from Iran, Latin America, South America, Europe as well. So we've been, we're definitely getting attention through the Innovation Cluster to our region, which has been pretty exciting to see. And I can tell you, all of those individuals are pretty excited to relocate from their countries, and not just to Canada, but relocate to to either Peterborough or the city of Kawartha Lakes, to our catchment area. So once again, Andrew and Rhonda, thank you very much for participating. It was very insightful, and we very much appreciate it. And to everyone else, hopefully our next breakfast is a in-person breakfast. And so be healthy, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks.